Okay, it's 1 o'clock at my time zone now. I'd start at least by introducing myself. So my name is Lyuba Zehl. I'm working at the EBRAINS AISBL, at the non-profit organization of the EBRAINS research infrastructure in Brussels. Before I started here, I actually was working for Timo, so I know the people very well. And you already had a full week of courses around the Jülich Brain Atlas and how to use Zebra. And you potentially also learned a bit already about eBrains, right? So my session today is going to be a bit interactive. So I'm happy, right, if you ask questions and you also need to say something sometimes. Okay, so my session today will be a general introduction in how to share, explore, and reuse data and knowledge that is part of eBrains. I rearranged my parts a bit compared to the abstract I proposed, but I think it still covers all the aspects that I promised. So in the first part, I'm just giving a bit of an overview, but as I said, feel free to interrupt. So I want to have this a bit interactive. So when it comes to sharing, there always arises the question, should we share or should we not share? And I think this is actually not really an option because you can just think sharing with your future self, you can't avoid that, right? So you may have working on data and then you had to do something else. And then in a couple of months or even in years, you're coming back and want to reuse those data that you previously produced. So you share with your future self. But of course, there is also the part that you are sharing with your colleagues, right? So a lot of you probably work already in institutes which have smaller collaborations on certain data projects or projects running or even software projects. And there you share with your colleagues. And then, of course, there are larger collaborations, as, for example, now between Jülich and Madras, where, right, there is maybe even a hurdle of cultural, of communication, of not regularly seeing each other as you would see people that are directly working with you in the lab. So you also have to share with those collaboration partners. And then the last step of sharing is, of course, if you're sharing your work with the world, so really with people that you do not know and you not directly interact, and preparing data for this last step of sharing, it's actually quite extensive. And you need to consider that you really need to be providing a lot of information around your data in order to make those data really reusable by others. And then if you're actually in the opposite direction, right? So you want to use data, you probably also encountered this problem, right? You find research papers and they're saying that they're working on certain data, but you actually cannot reach those data. Sometimes there's even no information given on where these data should be found. And sometimes maybe there is a link or a hint on where data should be found, but they are basically unreachable. Now, even if you find the archive where the data are located, it's sometimes hard to then find in those archives or in those data sharing platforms the data you actually need and want. So this is also a typical problem that a lot of you that are working with data from others probably encountered already. And then the final part again, is, well, even if you have then found your data that you really want to reuse, a lot of these data are not well described or not providing enough information for you by yourself actually being able to reuse them. And then, of course, there is the try and error run, maybe trying to get in touch with the original providers and so on. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And one of the solutions or one of the infrastructures that really tries to tackle all these issues is eBrains. So eBrains is an open research infrastructure, which is gathering data and then also including software tools and code, as well as computing facilities in order to make them available for others, for a broad community, and also make them explicitly interoperable with each other. And we have a couple of main services. So in the past couple of days, we're mainly working in the Brain Atlases services, right? With tools that are offered there. And I'm basically located at the data and knowledge service that is highlighted here in this picture. So fair data, tools, and compute facilities. One essential thing that EBRAINS is doing is we have a central data and knowledge management system, which covers management support. So really people that help you in preparing, organizing your data, and registering those data into the EBRAINS research infrastructure. We offer a long-term storage for those data. And then we have a publication service and a searchable resource where those data can be then found and made accessible. And then there are actually multiple services and tools working on those reachable data, which then directly, for example, allow you to visualize them, as you did, for example, in the Zebra Explorer in the last couple of days. Then we have constructually on this, I already mentioned this, for the interoperability and reuse services infrastructure, which are covering then the atlases, but also computational modeling, analysis tools, as well as workflows. Now, there's a different view on this. So here you can see we have various data types coming in, or various research products coming in, from experimental data from human, animals, or simulation studies. We have computational models that are shared through EBRAINS, software tools, and then also specifications for metadata or data models. And all of these are registered in, like, first they need to, of course, be located in a storage system, right? So they are uploaded to a storage. And then from there, we extract metadata around those research products that are then registered in a graph database. And that graph database makes then these findability, so high capabilities of searching through all of those registered data according to the metadata that I used to register them, and then finding them and making them accessible for, right, the computation options within EBRAINS, namely here highlighted the atlases, but then also modeling, analysis, and workflows. So we have a data and knowledge service, and we have other services that are building on those data and knowledge service. Now, the central data management system is called the EBRAINS Knowledge Graph. And that name actually entails a bunch of different tools that are jointly working together to make this graph database actually highly functional and interoperable with other tools. So we have a search user interface, which we will have a look at in a little bit. There's also an editor, which helps you to register metadata into the knowledge graph. There is a query builder, because we are talking here about a graph database, and writing queries for graph database systems can be quite cumbersome. And this query builder helps you to quickly click together a query body for your needs. Then we have the API, and actually also a couple of wrapping SDKs, so for Python and for Java, for example, on top of this API. And then there are automation tools, monitoring tools, and statistic tools that we're not gonna look into today. And then as part of this, I already said, we have a human, right, interaction here. So there is a curation service that helps you to go through all this management process for sharing your data. And this workflow typically entails, first, you need to make a request that you want to share your data. Then your data or your request is actually reviewed to see if you're fitting in with, for example, European regulations considering data protection, or ethics considering animal research. But once you're accepted, you enter into a curation, submission and curation phase. where you upload your data and work jointly together with a member of the curation service team to optimize your data representation within the knowledge graph to reach your maximum level of fairness. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with the term FAIR, with this acronym for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusable. We come to this also a bit later again. And then finally, if everyone, so if the curation team as well as you are happy with how your data are represented, those data are published and, for example, can also be assigned with a digital object identifier, a DOI, which allows other people also to cite your exact version of the data that was shared. Now, what we're going to look at is a bit the search user interface and its capabilities. I will also introduce on a high level the query builder, and then I show you a bit the Python package that allows you to do like interact with the metadata in the knowledge graph through Python. And finally, we're going to go a bit into how to prepare your data for this curation process, and introduce you also a bit to openMINDS, which is my personal project I'm involved in. And that is a metadata framework, actually, which defines all the different nodes within the graph database system of the knowledge graph. So which node types exist, how should they look like, what properties do they have, and how can they represent it in the end. Okay, so this is the first slide part. Any questions or comments already on this? No? Okay, then let's move to the first demo. So EBRAINS.eu, right? And you're landing on this page. Is this big enough for everyone?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm intentionally now going the longer way just to show you how to navigate through these pages and get to where you want to go. So we're on the main page of the EBRAINS EU part, and now I'm going into the Data Explorer. And you see that we have find data, share data, the live papers we're not going to look into today. But if you're interested later on and we have a little bit of time, I can tell you a bit about the live papers. So find data has here a huge button which tells you browse all eBRAINS data models and software, which immediately leads you to the eBRAINS search interface. And you see here that I'm today accessing this for a while now, so I agree to the terms of use in using this. And I also make this a bit bigger. And this is the search interface, and the first thing we want to have a look at. I'm switching back just to show you a bit other parts of where you can find here elements. For find data, you also will find then a full description of what actually the EBRAINS knowledge graph entails. There is the link to the full documentation, and then you have here already a summary on the different parts of the knowledge graph. So just in case you lose, you don't know where to find it again, just go over the main web page and click through those elements. For the share data part, there is the same option. So if we go to get started, we see here, right? Here is the request curation button, which you can then hit once you have data you want to share. There's also an option to directly get in touch with the curation team. And there's also an extensive documentation on the curation workflow available here. Okay, now let's switch to the search UI. So as you can see, we have here a search field. And of course, I can just type something in. I will now type a bit something related. So I can type, for example, almonds. And you can see that this is a full text search. So it's highlighting already that there are certain contributors here which have the name almonds. You also see, though, that the search field is associated with a suggestion mode in sense of if you're misspelling something, it will probably suggest to you that you misspelled something and switching. For names, of course, this is always a bit difficult. But in case you're searching for, let's see if this works. If I say adults, then it probably says, right, adult, and then I can switch. And it does the search text field on adults. So let's go back to now. I'm not sure if you already were shown the search interface. Probably it popped up during the Zebra presentations, but probably not in detail as I'm showing you now. So there are certain tags associated with these data set overview cards, as you can see here. This is top trending, meaning that this is one of the data sets that is frequently looked at and also frequently updated by the people that are producing this data. Then you see here that there are sometimes these little tags, right? And here we have probabilistic cytoarchitectonic map of the area 6V2. And this little tag tells me that there is in-depth metadata available. We have a couple of those tags available in the system, and you can always check them out by just hovering over them. So let's go to the Jülich Brain Atlas and the cytoarchitectonic map publication. So here you see that data sets are versioned. So people can submit the first version, and then every time there's an update, we can submit a new dataset version, and you can switch between those versions. For example, I can switch to the first release that was done in the EBRAINS Knowledge Graph, and see that also it looks a bit different, right? So at the time, the name was different, and the abstract was a bit different. But nowadays we are at the recent version, which is called like this. There's also an option, if you have multiple versions, to always look at the dataset overview independent of inversion. So for this one, there is an version independent abstract here with the general information that, for example, custodian is always Katrin Amunds for all of those datasets, and that the homepage, that's actually the old homepage. We should update that one. I'm just seeing that. And then you have an overview of those release dataset versions, which are then summarized here. And you can also, of course, again, jump here back to the dataset version card. Now we see that this dataset received a DOI. It is, and this one is an EBRAINS DOI. It could also receive, so we can also register datasets which are externally already published and already have a DOI. And then the DOI displayed here will be from the original publication. There is a release date associated to this one. And actually, we're currently in the process of releasing the version 3.1. We see that this dataset is free access, so meaning you don't have to basically register for this to get the data. There are sensitive data within the knowledge graph where authentication is needed by you, or even a more complicated process. Since we are in Europe, we have to comply to the General Data Protection Regulation, and that means that sensitive data are not just free accessible. You have to prove that you are not doing any misconduct or trying to re-identify the persons, and therefore they are highly protected in other research environments, which then have additional rules that you have to first follow before you get access to the data. Then, according to the FAIR principles, of course, all the data sets have a license assigned. And sometimes data sets might be also connected to a project. And a project actually means that there is a higher idea, a collaboration behind this, which is grouping multiple data sets from different parts. So on the one hand, we see here the individual probability map releases from the Jülich Brain Atlas. And I'm going to scroll down. Here we have the actual Atlas release. And there are also the ultra high or the 3D cytoarchitectonic maps, actually, which are part of the Big Brain released as part of this project. So I'm jumping back to the previous because this is a nice ground. Then you will find a typical summary, and then what you also will find is, for example, a support channel in some of the cases, and then some version specifications which tell you what changed from since the last version, for example. And you may also find some recommendations here for the specific version to be in place. The other thing is that you have on this part here a couple of, normally you would see this in journals as only keywords. And most of the time, keywords in journals are not really predefined, but it's left up to the user to state something, which is, of course, highly flexible, but on the other hand, makes an integration between different data sets difficult. And also it makes it difficult to associate your data sets with, for example, external resources and other data sharing initiatives that probably use ontologies. And within eBrains, as I said already, eBrains is adopting openMINDS as the metadata framework, which on the one hand defines all the different fields you see here consolidated on that landing page. And on the other hand, openMINDS provides you with control terminology that can be tagged onto your data set on specific property fields. And this, these terms are then, again, where possible, linked to external definition and ontologies. And here we're working in particular to get, with the Intellex project, which is an ontology integration platform, and the knowledge space, which is created by the INCF, the International Neuroinformatics Coordination Facility, which is providing basically a data catalog on databases. So here you will find multiple databases, eBrains, but also others from the US, that are then joined here based on the used ontologies. So they try to integrate this. So let's go back. So every time you see a link here, you can click on those and will be led to these term pages. You see, though, in some cases that there are less information provided. So this is one of the things that is like dynamically improved and constantly extended. And it's actually a community progress. So this is really done open source and transparently on the openMINDS pages. Okay, so now we went through these tags. And now let's switch from the overview to the data descriptor. I will come back to this as well later on. Data descriptors are basically human readable forms of what we structurally capture here within this graph database system. And this is really helpful because, of course, when you write something in a fluent text form, you can actually also reason and explain while certain decisions were made, what is more difficult to capture in a structural manner. And therefore, these data descriptors are giving a lot of insight into how to reuse and how to interpret the data that are shared. So I would really recommend to always try to provide a README or such a data descriptor with your data whenever you are handing them to someone else. Then in case of data are typically associated with other research publications, and often the researchers would like to have a composite citation if data are used. And here it's specifically explained how you should cite if you're using these data. And then, of course, we gonna have an overview of the actual data here within this UI search interface. And you see here that we have a couple of probably information files. So I mean, I know that there are information files. You would need to figure that out first. We have the data descriptor file in here, and then we have the different data that were stored for the different areas. And here you see the nifty files. So I can click on those, and then you see that the side part here will switch. On the one hand, this will inform you that if you're downloading those data, you have to agree to the terms of use of eBrains and the knowledge graph. And then here, this is actually a download file, so I can really download now that file. I can also I don't have to do that individually. I can also download the whole repository, or also zip subfolders of those in the download path. So this is possible. Then what I'd like to show you, yeah, I need to go to a different data set for this, but I will come back to this data description soon. Then we associate publications to this, and then we associate, of course, also specimen information. And here you see the statistics or summary of the specimens registered for the Jülich Brain Atlas. We see we have 23 subjects, 23 tissue samples, which are the brains or the brain slice collections that were obtained from those subjects. We know that all these subjects are Homo sapiens. And we see that there is a group defined versus the subjects and a collection defined versus single samples. And then we also see that we have both biological sex present in the subjects. And I mean, we can't have an even one since there are 23, but we see that it's relatively balanced between the biological sexes. And then finally, on these landing pages, you always get hint on how to use the metadata, so how to query metadata through EBRAINS programmatically, and there's also the link to the query builder again. And then there are hints on, there's the Knowledge Graph REST API, which we are not going to have a look at. We are going to have a look at the Knowledge Graph Core SDK, and here in particular the one from Python. And there is also another tool which is called FairGraph, which I wanted to present today, but we run into some issues, so I'm not going to present it today, but there is a very nice documentation online available, which helps you with the first steps. And I can show you this later. Okay, so I'm going to close this one because what I want to show you, let me just to show you another example. So this is a data set, an electrophysiological data set, which was performed in macaques. And you see here that this data set is actually formalized according to a formal structure and community standard because it's using certain standardizations within sharing these data. And we have here again a couple of associated elements. One more thing you see sometimes when it is defined, that there's more information, for example, on the behavioral tasks that you can link to. And what I want to show you here is the data part again, because here you can see we have filter and group options. So depending on how deep a curation and the metadata description goes, you can have additional grouping here, for example, by subject, which is in that case a bit boring. But you can also filter for certain file formats if they are already associated. And now I'm going to filter for the neural signals from the BlackRock microsystem, which is a specific toolpath. And then I see that only those files are filtered out and I could download them. The other big thing which is happening here is once a content type, which is a version-specific file format of a software tool is associated, actually the corresponding software tools that take this file as an input can be identified. And here you can see that this neural signal 2 format is actually an input format from all these different software versions. So one, the electroanalysis toolkit is the software, and the other one is Elephant as a software package. Okay, then we have now this major search field, which is a full text search. The other fields are actually here, which are very interesting. On the one hand, we have the categories, which give you an overview of the general size of the different categories which are registered. So we see that we have over 100 projects. We see we have over 100 data sets. And then we have computational models. We have only a few metadata models because that's a relatively new research product that we're registering. Same for the web services. And then we see we have contributors here. And I was previously searching for Katrin Amund's. And you see it will filter down to Katrin Amund's landing page, which gives you an overview of where she is a custodian or where she contributed to data sets or software. Now let's go back again and let's go to the data set. So what we also see for data sets is that there are filter functions here. And these are really faceted filters, meaning that they are connected to predefined queries in the background and are purely based on these tags, right? So on these really controlled tags, which are coming, which are defined by the metadata system and are used by the EBRAINS research infrastructure. A quite nice tag is, for example, for accessibility. If you really want to use for free access data, you can already click this, and that filters out all other data which are not directly available to you. And then I can also, for example, combine this now with a species, and it will further filter it down. And I can combine this with an experimental approach. And then maybe I also want to combine this with a brain region. And for example, here, say, HOC1 from the Jülich brain. And then I'm ending up with exactly 5 data sets, which fulfill all these criteria, right? So they are tagged with all these elements. This can be quite neat if you're exploring and try to find out something that you're looking for. And it is more precise than going over the search field, because just because somebody mentioned this in a full text somewhere just doesn't mean that you actually find something of that in your data directly attached. Then I come to this part, which is a bit interactive. So now I really need you to that's good. And it's intuitive. Yeah. And feel free, of course, to play around. And always, if you find a behavior weird, feel also always free to report this, right? So we are really improving by your feedback every single time. So let's come to the more interactive part. Let's switch back to the presentation mode. So this is part 2, and part 2 is a bit about actually trying to apply to these FAIR principles. And the FAIR principles, so I took the paper and just run it through a word cloud system, and it kind of already shows, right, that data are important, the metadata are important, but that there need to be principles in place in order to gain this. What I like a lot here is that humans come out very, very strongly, because metadata as well as data should be human readable, but they should also be machine readable. Standards can only be standards, so principles can only apply if actually community really likes those principles and then makes use of them. And you see a couple of more elements in here, which I find quite nice to make a point about why FAIR is so important. Now, our exercise is now the following. We want to improve metadata, so metadata or data. And I'll present a slide with a non-optimal data metadata scenario. And some of you might recognize some of these scenarios because you encountered them yourselves, either by having to deal with those data from others, or by maybe making the mistake yourself and then afterwards realizing that you should probably have done this differently. But they are very extremely presented in my case. So for each of the scenarios, you will have 50 seconds to spot what should be improved. And there's typically one issue that you should spot, not multiple ones per slide. And every time you identify the issue, you don't have to raise your hand, just either shout what is wrong or write it in the chat. Feel free to do it either way. And of course, avoiding then all those issues, I will see how you can solve them, will improve the overall fairness of your data and also facilitate your data sharing process as a consequence. So first thing, go ahead. What is wrong here? What could be better?
So I think there's no uniformity in the data.
Exactly. So I also see the chat coming in. Exactly. So there is no really consistency in each of the data field, in each of the cells, right? So neither for ID nor for sex. There's also, inconsistency in terms. Very nice. So how this should look better, right? Either way, how you solve it doesn't really matter, but do it consistently. There are already hints here, which we come on later for sorting purposes, but just be aware, you just need to be consistent. So what is wrong here?
There's no labeling.
Very good. I already see no header in capital no. Yes. So besides the header, and I mean, that becomes clear now for the next one. If we see the header, then actually there is an additional issue here, right? Units. Every time you share numbers, make clear what those numbers are, right? Of course, if this is just a count, it's just a count, and the number is sufficient. But in many, many cases, data are often, especially in tabular formats, when people are very familiar that they only work within one unit, they are not sharing this with the data. And that's a mistake in a sense of as soon as you are sharing those data with people not of your community or not of your field, they are gonna be lost. So always provide units, and especially in case of ages, this can vary quite a lot, right, between subjects, considering the range, and can actually mean different things. Next one. What is the difficulty here? When somebody says, well, I uncovered a super nice model. Yeah, exactly. So the context is not clear, right? So, and actually, besides the context, it's also always helpful to provide a definition and a source. And the person here actually was talking about cars, not even about the three suggested options, namely the animal model or the computational model or the supermodel. Okay, so next one. Can you spot the issue here? Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. There's always kind of different file formats. Exactly. So please, if you can, right? It doesn't mean that you only have one file format because you may have different data types, but for one data type, please stick to one file format only. That makes your life and the life of others so much easier. And if you can, take a file format that is actually known. That's already, I gave a hint already. So what's the issue here? It's actually not the lesser known, but it's actually a proprietary format. So you actually have to pay for this one. You cannot access these data directly, right? So proprietary formats, when you can, try to avoid them. This is not always possible. Not always, all of them are actually inaccessible for others. But a couple of them can only then, for example, be accessed if you have a paid license for the software that can read them. And this is, for data sharing and transparent and open science, not really what we want to have. So here, right, PLX is, I don't even remember, this is too long ago I created this, but you have to kind of pay for that format. And you can switch, for example, to NWB, which is the Neuroscience Without Border format, which can hold a couple of data sets. So next one. What is the issue here? Yes, inconsistent naming convention of files and folders. This is often, this is not, I mean, if people are having an historically grown project, this can happen quite easily. So it's not even something that is out of the scope of what I experienced, at least in the past. So if a project goes on for a very long time with, for example, a lot of students coming in and out, then these kind of errors typically occur, especially within internal file systems. So make sure to predefine conventions for shared repositories within your lab in order to avoid these kind of inconsistencies that can easily occur over time. So here we're going with the example. So next one. What is the issue here? Yes. Why is the order a problem here? The order is not I mean, it's actually ordered, but why is it not ordered according to what you would expect it to be? Let's say it like this. Assume that these slices are the only ones available. Yeah. It's actually about the leading zeros only. So as soon as you have numbers within your naming conventions, have leading zeros, because every file system will order the files, right? 1 is followed by 11, because that's an alphabetic ordering. Yeah, I think somebody wrote this before, if I saw correctly in the chat. The chat is small in my case, so yeah. So as soon as you have leading zeros, this ordering problem is not an issue anymore. So make always sure, if you have naming conventions with numbers, that you have leading zeros. Okay, next one. Yeah, already spotted. There was already the subfolder part, right? So there's an inconsistent foldering of the data. And there are two options actually here to deal with this. So with one rule though, either, so keep the structure as flat as possible, but as deep or nested as you need it to be in order to structure what you want to structure or highlight, right? So especially the case, the upper case here with a full flat structure, if you have a neat naming convention, which identifies, for example, here the different parts of the files, you want to keep flat structures, and that's especially for computational operation. These ones are quite nice because you don't have to follow any nesting of the folders. There is a question, if we are sharing the data, needs to have a standard nomenclature. I would say yes, it doesn't have to have, it should be a consistent nomenclature for you, definitely, right, for your data. And in the best case, you're following actually a data model, which predefines the nomenclature even across your data with other data, so that, right, somebody, so brain imaging data structure, some of you may have heard of that standard, actually defines file naming and folder naming and the file structure, like how you should provide folders within that repository. And this standard is relatively strict and ensures, therefore, everybody that follows that standard actually will provide a similar looking data repository, which is very nice for people from the outside world, right, to understand the data sets very quickly, and to, for example, run scripts, right, write programs, codes that can run on these repositories, and you can easily switch the data behind them because you know that they're following that standard. So yes, it's always preferred, but at least try to be consistent for yourself, right? So advantage here is you have a very easy way of getting to the data. Disadvantage, it's more difficult to read and to spot what the actual, right, elements, parts of the data sets are, and therefore the brain imaging data structure, for example, goes with a nested structure, and they always start with, for example, here, as we did as well, with a subject grouping. So they always have a subject folder first, and then there are other folders below for the brain imaging data structure, which I didn't show here now. Then the next one. So I actually already gave a hint for that one. That's right. We had the format again, but ignore the format for now. Yeah, exactly. No files in the subfolders, meaning that you basically have to specify this full path, right? From my data set to version 1, to subjects, to sub 1, to session 1, to MRI, to TV1, and so on, to just get to this one file, which is after this whole cascade of folders. So again, right? Try to keep a file hierarchy only as deep as needed. Avoid folders which only contain one other folder or one other file. These are typically not helpful, except you really need to highlight, right, that there are certain structures and so on. So a couple of you, I'm not sure, I don't remember which software, but some of the software, open source software, unfortunately, I don't remember. They actually, if you share the data directly as an output of those softwares, they will provide exactly these cascades of folders, which is for sharing really not nice. And if you want to share those kind of elements, you should reconsider restructuring them. On the other hand, if you actually want to keep those data being readable by the software, the software actually requires you to have those. So in case you can't avoid this, of course, this is fine, but explain somewhere, for example, in the data descriptor, why you have these complicated structures if they are not avoidable. Okay, next one. So where is the issue? So all of these things are true. However, let's assume the data, the researcher actually structured the subjects because there were more files. I'm just reducing here, right, what's in there. We could also leave this as. We have redundancies in the file naming. This is true. So we have recording 1 and recording 1 in both of the subfolders, which makes it the subfolders really required, right? Because flattening the structure would cause problems because we have two recording files with the same name. On the other hand, what we don't have are metadata that are accompanying those data, helping me to learn what is what, right? So in that case, and these kind of naming, by the way, so subject 1 and keeping the same name here can also have its advantages. So standards like the brain imaging data structure try to avoid that. And kind of concatenating the subfolder elements into the file name. So for example, having then sub 01 underscore recording 01. However, right, this also means that the file name typically gets longer and longer and longer. And the only important part is actually the last one, namely what this is, namely a recording. And this is the first recording of subject 1, and this is the first recording of subject 2. So this can also be an advantage to keep it like this. But if you have this or also sub 01, there's always the question of what is the subject, right? And what was the subject? So if I only provide the recording file, I probably don't have those metadata stored in there that are identifying the subject. Now, in case of NWB, this could actually be stored within, but it's also always good to have these kind of additional navigation files, helper files surrounding the data set that helps you to identify then what's going on. And this identifies that subject 1 is Homo sapiens and the subject 2 is actually also Homo sapiens. So then we go to the next one. Can you spot the problem here? This is actually an interesting one. Yeah, it could also been a CSV. There is a reason why, for example, the brain imaging data structure insists on TSVs. Can somebody say why CSV is sometimes not or is avoided by standards like BITS? What does CSV stand for? So some of you might say character separated value files and others might say comma separated value files. The problem with CSV is that not always a CSV is comma separated. A lot of people store CSVs with semicolon separators or with tab separators, but not specifying that this is actually a TSV. So the brain imaging data structure to insisted on specifying a TSV, which is a tab separated file. However, what I wanted to come to again is something that I already mentioned in the beginning. Of course, besides having metadata, structural metadata presented with your data, the other thing is to have a README presented with them. And these human readable, right, fluent text formats, they allow you to specify the what, the who, and the why. And the why is the most important part here, right? Because that is typically not captured in your structure. The why, for example, could explain why did I not use the naming convention sub-1 underscore recording -1, right? And so on. Amal, can you explain your comment?
Yeah, sure. So I was mentioning that using CSV data, using TSV data will be good in aspects of the simplicity of parsing, because in CSV it requires handling quoted strings, especially when data contains commas or new line characters within a cell. But when it comes to TSV, typically it's similar to parse, since tab characters are rarely part of the data, eliminating the need for codes and making the parsing process straightforward.
Ah, yeah, that's, yeah, good addition. Thank you. Okay, then I think the next one is our final one. So if you have a data descriptor and it looks like this, what is the issue? Can tell me anyone what this data is about? No details of the research. Yeah, that's actually a nice one, because no details of the research is actually not the point. There is no details on the data, right? So, and that's also the major difference between a data descriptor and whatever you write in a research paper. Normally, a research paper is, as the saying, right, it's about the research, right? So it's explaining the purpose of the research, what analysis you did, for what reason, what you wanted to discover. This is unimportant, less important for a data descriptor. The data descriptor focuses on describing the data, meaning it says exactly what data types is there, what is the size of the data, what is the format used, and as an addition, a data descriptor can state in a small chapter what the original purpose was to collect those data. And that's a very, very important difference, and also makes a data descriptor. I mean, some of you who had to write one will now laugh, but I would say a data descriptor is more easily to write than a research paper, right? Because a research paper, you have to do a lot of like embedding this into the literature, making sure you have a proper reasoning and so on. The data descriptor is really purely stating the facts and explaining the decisions of how those data were presented. So this is a bit like a major thing, and I see this mistake happening over and over again when we receive data descriptors within eBRAINS, because normally a lot of researchers are not used to write these kind of fact sheets about data, because of course in their mind, and this is fully explained, understandable, the important part is the research, but really see the data as another important part of your research, which can also have value completely independent of that research that you are conducting, especially if you're sharing this with others in the end. So this was the last one from this session. So we have half an hour left, and I want to give a quick introduction a bit to components behind graph database systems, and to introduce you a bit to openMINDS. So in the end, what we want to do is we want to share our data with the world. And what's then typically done in platforms like eBRAINS is that you come with your data, which are stored at your local storage, and you provide then the data and the metadata as files and upload them to a central storage system of that database platform. And then what is then typically done is that these data are linked to metadata that are extracted from those data. And those metadata, these are linked data. So I explicitly made this. And linked data are looking like this, right? So these are graph database systems, and you see these bubbles, and these are nodes, and nodes have connections, and nodes can be of specific types. For example, nodes can represent data sets, or nodes can represent persons, which are then associated to a data set through a connection, which is identifying them as an author or as a custodian, and so on. So, and once this graph structure is planned, you can then search, exactly have these search functionalities and filter functionalities that I showed you in the beginning. So what makes this more reliable and consistent in a graph database is actually if the graph database is working with the metadata framework. And EBRAINS is adopting openMINDS, which is a specific metadata framework for linked data, which was developed also in conjunction with graph database system experts to optimize a bit the not only the human readability part, but also the machine readability part from database systems. openMINDS also includes maps to ontologies and other standardization efforts, and it's really an open source project where everybody can contribute to. And I put down the support email and the major documentation here. So as I mentioned already, we have on the one hand the metadata models, and we have the controlled instances which link to ontologies, and then we have a couple of supportive tooling. I can quickly show you. So we have multiple metadata models, which go more and more in depth. So we have the core model, which covers basically all data directly surrounding research products. The SANS metadata model is more going into in-depth around brain atlases and common coordinates spaces. And then we have in-depth extension on electrophysiology, specimen preparation, chemical stimulation, computation, and publication. And then we have a nice like controlled terms definition, which provides you with typed terminologies, which are basically used by the controlled instances to provide then libraries for various of these term types. There are licenses. I already mentioned the content types in the beginning as software-specific data formats. We actually also register complete brain atlases and common coordinate systems, but then there are we register diseases, we register age categories, cell types, and so on. And those terms are then, wherever possible, connected to the outside world through the Intellex project and the knowledge space. And then we have supportive tooling. So we have a formatting pipeline, which means we have a relatively intuitive syntax to write the schemas, which also provide a bunch more options for database systems to interpret the schemas. But then since this is not really an official community format for schemas, we then translate those ones into various schema formats, for example, into JSON schema, but also provide them, for example, as Python classes or as MATLAB classes and so on. So which then ends up in the MATLAB package, and we have a Python package, and there's actually also a Java interpretation coming out soon. And then we also are working constantly on improving mappings to other standardization efforts and provide converters. And we are in the process. So within this week or early next week, we're going to have the first release of a bits to openMINDS converter. So which tries to automatically extract as many metadata as possible from a data set that comes in the brain imaging data structure and then translates it into a linked data model within openMINDS. So linked data, some of you may know this, some of you never heard of that term. I really just quickly try to cover the basics here from the computational point of view, from the programming point of view, because we are switching then to do a bit of code demo after that. So linked data can be stored in various formats, but one of a very typical format is JSON LD. And it's nice because you can easily read it. So a node within a graph database can be stored as a JSON LD, and it typically provides a couple of technical properties, which are always identifiable via this @. So the first one is just setting the context of the property namespace, which might be varying, and therefore it's easier to specify it above. And it also makes the property names later on more easily readable. The type actually sets the schema type that this instance is supposed to follow. So if I'm setting this to, for example, the openMINDS person schema, then every property in that JSON LD could be validated against the schema, and a validator would complain if it doesn't follow the suggested property and value specifications of the schema type person. And the @ID is a very, very important one. So the @ID specifies the unique identifier of this particular JSON LD, of this particular node. And this is a referenceable identifier. So meaning any other node that needs to link to that node can specify the reference via this @ID. So it's a globally unique identifier. And then, of course, we have various property names, which then can have various values. So as an example, we have here the contact information instance of the openMINDS metadata model. And we see that the namespace is quite long. And normally, if you want to have a compact writing, this is an easy way of doing this. You can also leave out the context and directly have this prefix in front of the property name, which would then be in front of the email. So that's also another way of writing this, but that's the nicer way. Then we have the type. So we have the full type, and we see that there is the contact information schema. And here, I normally, like the knowledge graph has even a prefix for the @ID, but the important part is actually the universally unique identifier, which is used here, which is this large number. So this is really a number generated, and this is unique in the world. So it can actually be also exchanged between systems. And then we provide the actual metadata, so the actual property of that contact information. In that case, it's just the email. And now if I have another instance, namely a person instance, we have the same elements here, but of course a different identifier, because this is the identifier of the person node. And then I can provide the properties of the given name and the family, and then the contact information of that person would exactly show you this. It would give you a dictionary which states the @ID and then the @ID of the link of the node that needs to be linked here. So now the person is linked to the contact information instance. So having the search UI is of course nice, but actually what you want to do if you want to reuse data or play around with the power of what the knowledge graph entails, programmatic accessing those metadata is of course preferred. And the KG Core Python SDK is a client library that accesses this knowledge graph metadata through Python. And you can install this. So via pip. I already did that. This is why I commented out here. And then you have to initialize this client. Now, working with programmatically with the knowledge graph requires you to authenticate yourself, meaning that you have to have an EBRAINS account, which allows you to authenticate yourself. So if you did not register, and then you are able to use this. Stating the KG client as such will actually run, like I actually can show you. So it will, first time you are using this client, will ask you to authenticate you. And then you just follow the instructions, and then afterwards the code will run after the authentication. So for the code in the following, I predefined some global prefixes, which are just too long to repeat over and over. So just be aware that there is a knowledge graph prefix and a knowledge graph vocab, and there is an openMINDS prefix and an openMINDS vocab part. So wherever you see this, those are just the global prefixes that are defined here. Now I want to retrieve an instance, so a node from the knowledge graph using now this universally unique identifiers. And you see here, first time I'm using the client, it's asking me then in the code, when I run the code, that I should authenticate myself. You can then just click on the link. It will open a browser window where you can confirm that you are aware of the terms of use. Once you confirm this, it will automatically continue the script if the authentication was successful, of course. Now, if we now check the retrieved instance, we check the ID, which we just do because we already provided here one. So I just extracted one for you. And now we, of course, want to know what the type is. So here I extracted actually a person. And now we want to check the simple value of this node. And we can just do this by calling an instance.data and then providing the full property name, which includes the openMINDS vocab, and then can print this. Now for complex values, these are then the linked instances. And for the person, for example, this is also true for the digital identifier of that person. And here we see that this is then exactly stated. So if I'm checking for the digital identifier in the person, it will give me this dictionary with an @ID and another UUID, another unified identifier to another node. Now, if I want to check out that link, then I actually have to retrieve again the linked instance via the UUID and then have to extract the information from there in order to see what that link is about. And here you can see that the digital identifier is actually linked to an ORCID schema, which then identifies the ORCID from, in that case, me. Now we have other complex values, and these are embedded objects. Embedded objects are not independent nodes within a graph database system, meaning that they are sharing the life cycle of the parent. So if I'm deleted from the knowledge graph as a person, my person node is deleted from the knowledge graph, the embedded objects, in that case, the affiliations, will immediately delete it as well. And here we're just going through this. So an affiliation then is directly embedded in the response part into the parent structure. And you also see that it doesn't have an @ID because in principle, nobody can directly link to that affiliation because that affiliation is fully connected to my person. So if somebody wants to link, then they have to go through the person. Now, embedded objects again, and you see this here, right, in this part. Can again have values which are complex and, for example, link outside of the thing again. So in that case, it's actually linking to an organization, right, which I was a member of for that affiliation. And now going through, right, the graph database system by just calling one instance after the other in order to figuring out what this instance is about is a bit cumbersome, and we will learn in a few minutes how to create a query-specific results from the knowledge graph, which already consolidates, right, these paths and just presents later on the wanted values that we want to search for. There are other ways of extracting instances, for example, via schema type. And then you have basically the response is containing all instances of a specific schema type. And here I'm doing this for a controlled term instance for the age categories. And these responses from the knowledge graph client, they actually are pages, right? So you see here that we in total get out 10 age category instances, and the size and total is here the same, so 10 and 10. And size is associated to the page. I come to this a bit later. So we just print here all the names from all the instances in that response by just identifying again the data and then going through them and calling for the names. Oh, this append twice. You don't need that twice, but that doesn't matter. So I already mentioned pages. So for techniques, we do the same thing as we did before. We are calling the techniques all instances of type technique, and we see here that there actually is a difference between the page size and the total number of technique instances. So the total number of technique instances within the knowledge graph is 317, but the client only calls the first 50. And there is a way of paginating, of going through these result pages without being without always having to call the next page. So if you just want to go through the first result page for testing, for example, you can just use again the data part in order to call the elements. And this data part will basically reduces you to the first page. So we see this here. We start our loop, right, at 1, and we end our loop at 50, which is exactly the page size, right, that was already indicated here. So now if we want to go through all the pages at once, we just call here items, and then we are continuously looping through until the end. And this is just here again, visualized loop starts at 1, and we actually end at the last technique at 317. Now, the actually interesting part is, of course, executing predefined queries. And I'm quickly switching to the query builder that I already mentioned in the beginning. And I prepared a query. So you can search, for example, for the entry point. My entry point is a subject. And I already saved a query here and said subject query simple. And that query, I decided, okay, I have a subject, and then I want to extract the species of that subject. I see that there are actually two options, right? Two types. A species, the species property can either link to a species control term or to a strain, which again has a species as part of it. So this I know because I'm very familiar with the openMINDS structure. Of course, if you start doing this, you probably have to play around a bit with this. Nice functionalities are, right, for species. I know that, for example, I can flatten this because I know that a subject can only belong to one exactly species. So I'm just going to flatten the output to just get the name of that species, which is identified within the species schema. Then within the strain schema, right, I have again a link to the species and to the label, and I can also fully flatten this to directly gain the species name in the end. And then I want to extract also the biological sex. So you can do this within this query builder by just clicking right through these elements of the subject and then further extending this. Just to show you this quickly, I can, for example, also say, right, is part of, and then it would link me to the objects that are connected to is part of, which is only a subject group here. And then I can, for example, ask for the number of subjects of that subject group, right? So this would how I could extend this. I'm going to delete this now because I want to run the query later on. This query is already saved. You can also save this in spaces which are actually shared. This one I did not share yet, but I can share later on for you to test. And then you can also run that query within the query builder directly. You see here the scope for release and progress. For you, this potentially doesn't make so much sense. I have the full power as a curator within eBRAINS. I actually can see all the in progress instances as well. Here you see that the query builder itself also has, right, a size option of the results. So here it's lower, it's not 50, it's down set to 20. And you can actually also paginate through here in case of when to set a start and then just iterate through by calling this. If I run this query now, it will show me, right, size of the page is here 20. The total size of the subjects found are over like 4,995. And then we have here the data of the first 20 subjects, and we see we extracted the biological sex, the species with strain in that case is 0, and the species here is Homo sapiens. So if I go to the last one, probably there's also, no, this is actually nice that this worked out. So here, for example, we have a male subject, which is actually defined through a strain, which then is of type Rattus norvegicus. So for example, it could be a Vista strain that was used here, and then Rattus norvegicus is listed as the species. And then the species that is directly linked is of course not specified. So I know that I'm running, but just to show you that we basically can also perform the same thing through Python, as this query actually has received also a UUID, and this is actually visible here in the address bar. And this UUID I just pasted into my code, and then I'm executing now the query through my Python code. And here I again look at the page size and the total number, and we see here, right, query results. In that case, from Python, I always default 50. I can also reset the size in the code if I want to. And then the total size is 4,995. And then I can check out the individual query results. Here I just took the first one of the first page and the last one of the first page. And just to show you again that here is a subject with a direct species link, right? So species Homo sapiens. And here is a subject with an indirect link to the species through the strain. So Rattus norvegicus. And then we can also consolidate, of course, through all the elements of that query and see how many, what strains and what species and what biological sexes are present in those over 4,000 subjects. And then we see that we have a variety, right, of species defined for subjects, and actually also species, also subjects which do not have any species defined. And the same goes for the biological sex. So not defined is set within my code as if there's nothing specified. Not detectable is actually an official term within openMINDS, meaning that really the sex was not detectable from that object, which is typically done for like very early development stages, right, of certain animals. Okay, so that is the code summary of the knowledge graph. So we only now looked at how to retrieve instances. We actually can also push instances to the knowledge graph. However, there is an issue currently with accessing the spaces, and therefore I'm not going to show you this particular, but I want to quickly show you how to create these JSON LDs, prepare for them already with the openMINDS Python package. And there's also another package, Fairgraph, which allows you to directly define openMINDS Python and then push them to openMINDS Python instances and then push them to the knowledge graph. But we look at the base part here from the openMINDS Python part. So you can again install this via pip. And then you're initializing the collection that you want to create, which is basically a smaller graph, a subgraph of your data representation, right, of your data. The other elements that I pasted in here, I just need for printing and for defining some parts. So we initialize the collection. And then we, for example, can create an organization. And here I just say, well, please create me an organization, give it a full name, which is the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios. I can provide it with a short name, and then I also can provide a homepage which is an RI type. That's why it's specifically linked here. Now, if I'm looking at that created JSON LD, it actually looks as we would expect it. So it defines the vocab, the type, and then we have the affiliation. What is missing here, as you can see, is the ID, right? The add ID is not yet given, which is the reason because it's a single instance, which is not yet added to the collection and therefore doesn't receive a type yet, an add ID yet. So then we can do the same with the person. So we're here creating a person with a given name and a family name. And we also connect here the affiliation we just in the affiliation, we just also connect basically the organization we just created. Now, if I print that person, we have again all the elements we need, and we also see that the affiliation is an embedded value, as I showed you before, which then has also a member integrated here, which is the affiliation that we previously connected. So you already see that there's the linkage between the person and the member organization. Now we add all to the collection, and as soon as we add those to the collection, actually locally we define a smaller version of these unique identifiers because we're just working locally, and this locally unique ID is now assigned to the individual nodes. And then I can also validate that collection against openMINDS rules and then save it in a JSON LD file. And I'll show you how this looks. So that would be a small version of that, right? We have a person and we have an organization, and they are linked to each other through the affiliation here. It's probably not large enough. Sorry, guys. And that's part of this. And then if I also want to work later on this collection again, I can also reload this, right? And then add, for example, another person. Here, of course, I'm able to directly link the organization again because the code previously stated the MGM as a variable. Otherwise, I would have to call it via the ID directly. But I can also save that other person then to the collection, and then I have two persons as part of that collection. So, and with that, I'm at the end, 2 minutes before, but I'm happy to answer any question. I'd say we wrap up here. I'm happy to answer also any questions you may have later. Feel free to get in touch, especially about EBRAINS data, how to use them, how to share them. But also, if you want to contribute to openMINDS as a metadata framework, feel always free to go through our GitHubs and raise issues or get in touch with us via our support email. Otherwise, I hope I at least showed you a bit the power of what you can do within the knowledge graph search interface, but also that you actually have programmatic access. I know for the people that are programming affine, it was relatively high level. You can go very deep within the knowledge graph, right? So in principle, you can really do metadata based analysis and then extract resulting data via download IRIs and then access them if they are free access them to to public access protocols and then interact with those data directly. And this goes down to file assignments in the best case when there's in-depth descriptions available. So I hope you had at least a bit fun. And I hope you learned something new that wasn't presented to you already in the past couple of days. Whenever you want to get in touch, please get in touch. Have a good day. And thanks for listening today.